Good morning and welcome to the Point. This morning, we'll talk with the new leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. It was just last week we introduced you to the new Speaker of the House, and it all comes as the legislature has wrapped up for the year. They completed a new energy bill that will set the policy for years to come. Lawmakers also dealt with rules regarding suspension of students who commit certain actions that required mandatory punishment. There are new penalties for child caregivers who violate state policy, and there is a new bill that will have a big impact on the veterans home system here in the state, including the one right here in Grand Rapids. But all of that happened after we sat down to talk with East Lansing's Representative Sam Singh. Let's start with congratulations on your new leadership position. This is going to be an interesting time with a new speaker and a new leader for the Democrats. What's your take on how this coalition is going to work? Because one of the things we know is that being in the minority is sometimes one of those positions where it feels like you have a big wave that just rushes over you when legislation gets started. But I've talked with the new speaker, and he seems, at least on the surface, to want to include Democrats.
Sure. You know, we're very willing to work with the other side of the aisle. We have been over the last 4 years that I've been in office, and I'm looking forward to those times that we can find common issues and common values. But those instances where we don't have those, you know, I'm very willing to make sure that we are the voice of the people, make sure that that voice is heard in the legislative process.
The makeup of the legislature did not change dramatically after this past election cycle, this very unusual election cycle. So as you come back in, what's your game plan as the new leader for Democrats? What would you like to accomplish, and how do you set about that?
Well, again, I think that one of the first things that we'll start focusing on will be the budget for next year. One of the key areas is around education funding. The governor has a report on his desk right now that has shown that he has underfunded education over the last 6 years all throughout the state. We're going to hold him accountable to make sure that he's putting a budget together that actually starts fixing that underinvestment in education. We'll also be focusing on economic policy to make sure that the economy is working for all people. I think some of the policies that have happened over the last 4 years and the policies that are being discussed right now in lame duck are not actually helping talk about those issues that working people want to see their state legislature deal with.
Well, let's talk about education funding for a minute, because that is a constant argument between Republicans and Democrats about how much, where, and allocations. What would you like to see that would fix what you see as the underfunding? How would that look?
Well, again, I think one of the key things we haven't had before is the fact we have this report that the governor actually asked for and put forward through an RFP. And so now we know that there's a lack of investment all throughout the state. You know, we have higher classroom sizes. That's something that the general public wants changed. They want to make sure these resources coming from the state are actually going into the classroom. And unfortunately, what we've done is we've balanced the state's budget on the backs of those local school districts, also on local communities as well. That's why we have less police and fire. And so as we go forward, we're going to be talking about that investment to make sure that that investment is getting out of the state and into those local communities, because that's where people want those resources to be.
When you look at that kind of an allocation, when you look at that kind of a change, I mean, the governor's people would say, well, look, we're doing part of that to prop up the retirement systems that are out there with these big unfunded liabilities out there, and part of that manifests itself in a reform of that retirement system going forward. So is that part of the fix, to look at some kind of change in the retirement system?
Well, the retirement system was looked at in 2012. The governor has actually said that he's very comfortable that the changes that he made in 2012 are the changes that he wants. So the changes that are being discussed right now in lame duck that might potentially go into next year, all they actually do is cost more to the taxpayer. And we're talking about potentially $600 million every year just to make any of the changes that are being discussed by Republicans right now. That's one of the reasons why the governor's been opposed to those changes. So to me, what we have to do is talk about classroom sizes and money to the local school districts to make sure they get into the classroom. And that's going to be our emphasis on the education side. When you take a look at revenue sharing, we've also made sure that there's not enough resources into local communities. That's one of the reasons why you're seeing them have those financial difficulties. It's why they've had to lay off police and fire. And again, we're going to talk about how we take allocation of resources out of the state and put them in local communities, and that's something we're going to fight for.
So where does that money come from? Because one of the arguments that I've heard from your side of the aisle for the last 6 years is there were big tax cuts for businesses in the state, and it's time for them to put some money back into the coffers to do some of those things. Is that your thought?
Well, again, I think we have to take a look at that. There was $2 billion of tax cuts, and now you see the governor actually looking at additional incentives for economic development, because that hasn't actually created the jobs that we all thought it would. And so to me, it is one of the areas that the business community has to take a look at. Are they paying their fair share into local communities? And but beyond that, there are resources that are going into the corrections area. They're going into economic development at MEDC, and I believe those dollars should actually be in the local communities. So I think there are things that we can be doing in a bipartisan way that will actually get those resources down. And again, that's what we have to hold the governor accountable. He now knows and has reports on his desk that are showing that his policies have not helped local communities, and that's why people are hurting. That's why we're having a lot of the concerns that we're having right now in lame duck. And if he wants to actually solve those problems, Democrats will be there ready to work for him.
When you think of the educational system, it goes well beyond K through 12, which is what we've been discussing here. But there is also the higher education component, and I know you're very wired into the higher education community and the cost associated with that, because it continues to go up and be a real burden for families or for students who come out with those high not high interest loans, but high dollar amount loans. Is that something that at some point in this state, the legislature, governor, Republicans, Democrats are going to be able to get their arms around and do something with? Or is that one of those things that, because of the separation of the universities from the state to some degree, is more difficult to do?
Well, I think we have to deal with this issue. Again, if you talk to the average Michigan resident, they want to see something done on higher education. They want those dollars to come into their local community. They don't feel the economy's been working for them. And again, that's who we care about as Democrats, and that's the focus we're going to have, whether it's policy or budget. And if the governor wants to really tackle tough issues, he's got to address this issue. We're now ranked 40th out of 50 states in actual investment to the student. We actually have cut higher education the way he did when he first came into office by 15%, all higher education institutions. There's still 5 institutions that haven't been made up whole since those cuts that he made 6 years ago. So for us, if we're going to try to help the average citizen, help their kids make it through college without a lot of debt, we have to solve this problem. And unfortunately, we've seen 6 years of inaction by this governor, 6 years of inaction by the legislature, and that's going to be another area of emphasis for Democrats going into next year.
Going into next year looks a lot like it has for the last 6 years. Republicans are in charge in the House, they're in charge in the Senate, they've got the governor's office. Arguably, all of the controls of government are largely in their hands. So how do you then, as the loyal opposition, not only make your voice heard, but make that change you're talking about?
Well, we've been able to do that in a number of areas. We were able to do that with the expansion of Medicaid. We were able to do that with minimum wage. We were able to do that, hopefully, with the energy policy that we've been discussing for the last year and a half. And so as we go forward, those are the same areas. When there's times where we can work together, we will do that. And when there's not time, we'll actually put up the mirror to their face, show them what they're doing and why that's impacting local residents in such a negative way. You know, they stood on a campaign that they were going to help the average middle-class citizen of our state. We've not seen them do that over the last 6 years, but if that was going to be their campaign plan this last November, we're going to hold them accountable. And if they don't make those changes, they will be held accountable in 2018. You
touched on something that I think there are a lot of people watching this program would like to know more about. And when you talk about revenue sharing, now I appreciate for many people watching this morning, it's something that they're aware of, but they don't know what it is. But we have a lot of folks that are involved in city government, and township government, and county government. They know all too well what it means and how it has been cut, going back not just this administration, but the administration previous. So if you were to do something about revenue sharing, how do you do it, and what kind of dollars and cents are you talking about?
Well, I think you're talking a significant amount of resources. Again, if you take a look at what's happened over the last 14 to 15 years, we've cut about $6 billion away from local governments. So that's why we have 2,400 less police officers, over 2,000 less firefighters in the state of Michigan on the local level. Again, the state has balanced the budget on the backs of these local communities and these local school districts. And so if we are going to solve this problem, I know we can't probably do it in 1 year, but you have to have a thoughtful plan to go over maybe 3 or 4 years to make sure we have that investment, because these communities have been suffering and we need to make them whole. And that was the whole plan. When you had a tough economic time, you took the cuts. But when the times got better, they have not seen the benefit of that. And that's been the mistakes of this administration. And so, you know, I was pleased to see that they made a new hire within the Treasury Department to specifically talk about municipal finance and make sure we can make these communities whole again. And I'm hopeful that we will have conversations that will lead into a better budget for those local communities. But again, what we have to do is find real resources to go back, because we have to hire new police and new fire to make sure our communities are safe.
When you approach the budget process, every other year you're dealing with about a third of the new members who have never dealt with a $55 billion budget and don't understand the constraints of money that is earmarked, that absolutely has to be spent in certain areas, and how much of that federal money comes with all those strings attached. How difficult is it to bring them up to speed, understanding that they're all very willing and very eager to learn? They come from some government backgrounds, but it's quite an animal to deal with in that budget.
It is, and oftentimes what you see is you have elected officials coming here to the state capitol that haven't even opened up the budget, but they made a set of campaign promises throughout their election without even knowing the actual impact. And so I know for us and on the Democratic side, very early on we go through training so people understand all the different nuances of the budget. We make sure that our budget priorities are things that are manageable, that can be balanced, but make sure they show our priorities about helping individuals, make sure our local communities and schools are being well funded. And those are the things that we do right away because we want to make sure everyone understands the true impact of the budget. I'm really concerned as you take a look at what might be happening on the national level, when you take a look at concerns around Medicaid, Social Security, and so forth. There's a lot of uncertainty at the national level. And since you have that uncertainty, you don't know what those programs are going to look like. To make changes on the state level right now, or even in the beginning of next session, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We should know what the lay of the land is before you make any dramatic changes. And that's why we've been fighting a number of the changes here in lame duck, because we didn't want to see those changes made until we actually knew what the national scene would look like and how we'd be looking at retiree health care, how we'd be looking at Medicaid and Medicare. And so those programs have to have an understanding of what they're going to look like on a national perspective before we can actually do anything here on the state level.
So for Representative Singh, his new job is to lead Democrats in Lansing, but after this last election cycle, they still don't have the majority that they had hoped for. We'll talk about what that election means next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Representative Sam Singh will be the new leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives for the new session. When we sat down to talk to him, we obviously talked about his priorities, but we also talked about the impact of the election just passed. Let's talk a little bit about this election passed, because you referenced it, that it could make changes in fundamental policies that are impacted here on the state level as well. It was an election that had an outcome that for at least half of the people in the country was surprising, and certainly has an impact on everything from energy that we had talked about, the social programs that you talked about, and could be any number of things going forward. Does that change your approach at all, what you do here on the state level? Because given that it's the federal government, it likely isn't going to happen quickly, but it could still happen.
Well, I mean, I think that's part of what my concern is as we move forward as a state and as a country. You have a president-elect who did not win the popular vote. Now it looks like about 2.6 million difference between him and Secretary Clinton. And you would think he would be trying to bring the country together. And unfortunately, what we've seen here during the transition is anything but that. You know, he's tweeting about Saturday Night Live and things that people don't want their president to be talking about. They want to talk about real policy. They want to talk that we're going to be secure internationally. And he's not having those conversations at the level incoming presidents have done in the past. And so I'm really concerned about what that means for us as a country going forward. And that will then have impact on us on the state level as we have to make decisions. But again, if this president doesn't start focusing on the international conversations, to hear that he's not taking the full briefings he should be on, the intelligence briefings and so forth, we could see an economy really changed by the Chinese and the Russians just based on financial decisions they make in their own countries. And for him not to be focused on that and be worried about what's being said by a cast on Hamilton and Saturday Night Live is a little embarrassing, to be honest with you. And for us as a state level, I want to have some consistency. So as we make policy, we're not actually hurting people, we're actually benefiting them. And what we've seen on the national level hasn't really made me feel very comfortable that we're going to have that level of understanding going forward.
This is more politics than governance, but I want to ask you, because you've been around and you have watched this, you've been at the local level, you've certainly been here at the state level, and now you're going to lead your caucus. What did this last election tell us, if anything, about either the political process, the electorate, us? What did it say?
Well, you know, as a Democrat, I was obviously disappointed with the election results, but at the same point in time, this election was very different. It was a scorched earth election by the president-elect that really divided the country, which is why you're seeing even today a lot of concern from people on all sides of the political spectrum. They're still concerned about the financial interest that he has, the conflict of interest that his family has, that a lot of people feel that he's just going to use the presidency to privately inure him and his family and his close friends, and that's something you've never seen by a past president. So there's a lot of concern out there, and you would hope that he would be focusing on trying to unify this country, and he's not doing that. And so I've watched that election. Obviously there's things as Democrats we should do differently as we move forward. We're going to focus on those individuals who feel that this economy is not working for them. We want to make sure that their voices are heard. But you just had an election result, and one of the first things that the majority does here is try to take away their pensions, take away their retiree health care. That's not making them more stable in their local communities. And so to me, there's a disconnect between what the state Republicans are trying to do here in lame duck, as well as the National Republican Party once the election was over. But those people that felt like the economy wasn't working for them, we're not going to walk away from them as the Republicans have done post-election.
When you look at Lansing, after having some experience here and seeing how it works over in the House chamber, obviously the Senate too, but you've spent your time in the House, is the House more or less functional? And you can't necessarily judge what the next term will look like, but given your best guess going forward, is it more or less functional? Because there have been times when we've heard criticism. We understand that most of this is reserved for the federal level, but there have been times here in Lansing when it's been hard to come to a consensus.
Well, yeah, I think oftentimes you've seen where House Democrats have actually found consensus with Senate Republicans and the governor, and then you'd have a small group of Tea Party Republicans really hijack the process. And so you saw an investment in roads that should have been robust. Actually, we didn't see that. And so now the $1.2 billion we needed every year won't actually be in the state coffers until 2021. So that means when people thought the higher taxes that they're paying now, that they were going to actually see their roads get fixed at a more proper rate. Well, they're not going to. And so I think we made decisions, and I wouldn't say we, because we voted against that. Republicans have made decisions over the last 2 years that weren't really in the benefit to the overall citizen and making our state more economically viable. And that's because House Republicans let a small group of Tea Party people really move them too far to the right when you had Senate Republicans and the governor willing to find compromise with Democrats. And my hope is as we move forward into the next term, even though they're going to be more conservative, I hope they're more pragmatic. I hope they put the state before their party, because that is really what we need right now. Is we need leadership that really says, I want to invest in the state of Michigan to make sure we're most competitive in a global economy, as well as competitive with other states. And that should be the first thing that we do. When we take that oath to the Constitution, the state comes first, not a political party, not a family who might have invested in me. We need to have those types of resources that we actually believe in making sure that Michigan is viable on a global stage.
You talked about education, you talked about revenue sharing, which comes down to public safety in very many cases. We talked about higher education, you talked about the concerns about some of the social safety net that would largely be impacted by Washington. What else do you, as the leader of the caucus in the House of Representatives, want to make sure that you try to nail down over the next 24 months? Because we've got another big watershed election coming up in 2 years. There'll be a new governor. There'll be a dozen and a half, more than that, seats that will, senators that will be gone. Another third of your chamber will be gone. What do you need to get done in this next 2 years beyond those things?
It's about jobs. I want to make sure that we actually have the resources going to skilled trade training. We know there's a number of positions across the state that we can't get filled, and we need more dollars investment into that job training so people can get back to work. We need to make sure people need to get retrained, that those resources are there. And I think for too long we've waited for the federal dollars to come in. We have to put our own skin in the game, both from local resources and from the business community. We need to make sure our workers are prepared. I take a look at the earned income tax credit. We give out a lot of resources to a lot of different companies, and unfortunately we actually give out resources to companies that outsource. When I say if you got somebody who's working 2 jobs and their family's trying to make their ends meet, why not make sure those who are earning income have a little bit of a tax credit at the end of the year so they can make sure their financial security is there. So there will be a lot of those types of things that we're focused on that will impact those that are trying to make it into the middle class, those that are working hard. We want to be able to reward that, whether that's through job training or actual investments through tax policy, which unfortunately we haven't seen happen over the last 6 years.
This is completely unscientific, but I've interviewed a number of incoming freshmen that will be from the West Michigan area, the area that we cover. I've talked to the governor over the course of a number of years. I talked to the speaker-elect. Everybody has talked about skilled trades. I hear all of this conversation about skilled trades, and I always harken back to the day when those things were actually taught in high school. But I've heard people talk about community college programs and expanding those. Seems to me that that's one area where there is already some consensus. Is that something you think early next year that the legislature could get a hold of? Because there are estimates that there are, 90,000 unfilled jobs that need skilled trade people out there in the state right now. 90,000 more jobs on the tax rolls would be a big deal.
Absolutely. Again, like I said, there are times where we will work across the aisle. We want to work. The Michigan citizens want us to work across the aisle. And again, we've highlighted that area as being an area that needs to have more investment. Again, the worker retraining, making sure that higher education is affordable, whether it's at community college or higher ed. Those are things that we value. And if the other side sees those as a value as well, we'll be there to work in partnership. And when they're not, we'll make sure that the state understands that that investment didn't happen because they had other priorities.
I've got two small children. One of them is 8, one of them is 3.5. And I can tell you that that period of time flies by. Your time in the House, you're entering your final 2 years.
Yeah.
But it seems like it was 15 minutes ago when I first met you as you came in the front door. What has this been like now to wrap up your last 2 years as the leader of your party?
Well, again, it's been a great honor to serve the 69th District, be able to provide resources to make sure that as citizens needed help, we could make sure they got connected to the right state department. So that's always a very fulfilling thing. But being elected by my caucus to lead them both as the floor leader this term and now as their leader going into next term has been a great honor. And as I said, I've got strong priorities about investment because I grew up in a Michigan where we were competitive economically. We had the best infrastructure. We had the best schools. And for me, I want to see that again. My wife and I are starting a family. And for me, I want to make sure as we do that, that we actually have those resources available. And we've lost that. And to me, that's why whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent, Michigan should come first. That investment should come first, and that's going to be my priority of the next 2 years, and it's a great honor that my colleagues have chosen me to lead that effort.
Of course, a new year in Lansing and a whole new set of issues to deal with. That's just one of the things we'll continue to talk with Representative Singh about as the year goes by, and we'll be back with more to the point. There are a number of new faces that will be representing you in Lansing. We've already introduced you to a few, and in shows in the future, we have more new representatives for you to get acquainted with. Such will be the case on our next show. That will be in 2 weeks. We won't be here on Christmas or on New Year's Day, but we wish you a very pleasant holiday season, and we'll see you in the new year. To the point.